Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful, creepy little human being. You, welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or BRATTERSTEIN, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be talking about a man named Josef Fritzl. Are you familiar with this piece of human garbage? But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically, you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want. They're both BRATTERSTEIN, but no pressure. So, today's video, dude, is sponsored by Dossier. Dossier is still a member of this Brat Pack. And now, if you are unfamiliar with who Dossier is, I'm going to get you familiar with Dossier. Dossier is a fragrance company that makes luxury scents at a fraction of luxury prices. And where they had previously been doing just perfumes, did you hear that Dossier is now making candles? Did you hear that? Well, guess what? Dossier is now making candles, and they're exact scent copies of some of their most intoxicating and favorited perfumes from their website. Dude. So I got the scent Gourmand White Flowers, which is inspired by the Viktor and Rolf perfume called Flower Bomb. And oh my god, dude, okay, listen. I have not ever tried the perfume Flower Bomb because I don't have those sort of dollars for a perfume that expensive. But if it smells anything like this candle, I'm gonna need to smell like that on my body. And lucky for me, I know the Dossier has a perfume that smells exactly like this, so I can smell just like this without spending Viktor and Rolf Flower Bomb dollar bills, y'all. You know what I mean? I think you know what I mean. Oh man. Okay, so what does it smell like to me? It smells like to me that there was a woman, a fancy woman, this woman has money, and she went into a little bakery, this cute little bakery, and she bought herself a cheese Danish, and then she went over to the LA Flower Mart, and she's just walking around picking up some flowers to bring home with a baguette to her house, like you see in every movie, and she's just very fancy, and that's what this smells like. And I think I want to be her, and I think you would too. Anyways, guys, Dossier is offering members of the Brat Pack 10% off with the code BRATTERSTEIN at checkout, like always. And I would personally get on it, especially right now with the candles, because it is now candle season, which I could argue that every day of the year is candle time. But, you know, traditionally, this is the candle time of the year. And man, if you want to snuggle up on your couch with your blankets and your pillows, light your candles, and feel like a fancy bakery flower shop lady, you can do so at Dossier using the code BRATTERSTEIN at checkout. And I just want to say one more quick thank you to Dossier for wanting to work with me. It's so cool to have a company that you love so much want to work with you. It's very validating. And of course, I want to thank you guys for always being so tight and just supportive. You support everything I do, and that's so cool because you don't have to. But you do because you're awesome. So you rock. Don't ever change. So now that I am done spreading the good word of Dossier, we can get into this case. And bro, this case is absolutely wild and disgusting and horrible, and it's one that I had never heard of before, but I got several requests to do this particular case. Several requests by a subscriber named Amy. Do not think I didn't see you, Amy. I definitely did. I saw all of your suggestions, and this one was also suggested by my sister and a subscriber named Katie Ann. And once I started looking into it, I could see why you had become so consumed in this case, because wow. Now, for those of you who do not know, this is gonna be a survival story, technically, but it's gonna be a very different survival story than we have ever covered on this channel here. Basically, in 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elisabeth Fritzl disappeared into thin air, and she wasn't seen alive again for 24 years. 24 years, okay? And when she finally reemerged and told police where she had been, what had happened to her, it blew everyone's minds. Elisabeth told police that for the last 24 years, she had been kept in a cellar, an underground cellar, and was used as a sex slave for all those years. She also told police that while down in her dungeon, she had given birth alone 7 times. Under freaking ground, she gave birth to 7 children, okay? And her captor, her rapist, the father of her children, was none other than her own biological father, Josef Fritzl. This story is gnarly as hell. That being said, I'm going to tell you the whole story today, and I think this is going to be a long one. And while I tell you that story, I'm going to be putting on a full face of makeup. Now, if that's not your thing, thanks for hanging out this long. You seem cool. I hope you find a channel you like more, but if you're on the fence, you're not sure how you feel, maybe stick around. You might be surprised by how much you like me. So that's just my suggestion. Now, let's just get into this awful story. So come, gather around, and let me tell you the story of Josef Fritzl and his daughter, Elisabeth Fritzl, who he kept as a sex slave in his cellar for 24 years. In a small town in Austria in August of 1984, a young woman, an 18-year-old girl named Elisabeth Fritzl, disappeared. She was just gone, but she didn't take any of her stuff with her, nothing at all, not even any form of identification. She just up and left it all in the wind. This may have seemed odd, but it wasn't the first time that Elisabeth had just ran away. Just 2 years before her disappearance, when she was 16 years old, Elisabeth had run away with a friend to Vienna, but police quickly found them both and brought Elisabeth right back home to her parents. So when she went missing again, though her family was worried, they didn't think it was especially unusual or out of character for Elisabeth. But even though they didn't think it was totally weird, they did still try to find Elisabeth. They even ended up calling extended family to come over and help them, and this is when they would all go out and look for her. They ended up looking in all the places where homeless people gathered because according to Elisabeth's aunt, most young girls who disappear end up in those areas. But when they searched the bus stations, the trains, things like that, they found nothing. And when they realized that they weren't going to find there themselves, Elisabeth's parents, Rosemary and Josef, went to the police and filed a missing persons report. A few days after Elisabeth disappeared, on August 28, 1984, the Fritzl family actually received a letter from Elisabeth, and it had essentially said that, like, she was gone, don't look for her, she's 18 years old, she's out this bitch, deuces, I'm joining a cult and I'm running away. And that's it. And according to reports, Elisabeth's family seemed relatively okay with this explanation. They didn't question it too much. But Elisabeth's friends, those who knew her, those who spent a lot of time with her and got to know her on a more personal level like that, did not buy this at all. They were just kind of like, we know her, we know her character, we know what she likes and what she doesn't like. She grew up in a super strict family. She didn't really go out much. She wasn't adventurous. How would she even find a cult, A? And B, what would possess her to so randomly run off and join one? They were just like, this seems like a little bit of bullshit. They said that they did buy that she would run away, and if she did, maybe she was overseas, but she definitely had not joined a random cult. Elisabeth was just gone, missing, and she would stay this way for 24 years. And when she finally did resurface and told everybody her story, the story of the 2 decades of absolute horror that she went through, no one could ever have believed that this is where she had been. Elisabeth had been kidnapped and held captive in a cellar for 24 years. For 8,516 days, she was beaten, abused, raped, impregnated. She had to live through unplanned and unwanted at-home births, several of them, 7 of them, and had to live through watching one of her children die in front of her. All that time, her family and friends were under the impression that Elisabeth had left willingly, but in reality, she was being held captive at the whim of a madman. And this madman was her own father, Josef Fritzl. When she was young, Elisabeth was just known as being a good person. A good kid, friendly, playful. She was fun and loved to laugh and was well behaved. She was curious and pensive, often spending time staring out the window and daydreaming. Whatever her deepest dreams were, she'd get lost in them. In hindsight, she was likely trying to disassociate, and she did this mostly when she was in her own house. When she was home, she was very different than she was when she was out in the world. She'd close in on herself and just sort of lose interest in the things she loved. She sort of became a shell of herself, and as she got older, this sort of spilled into her outside life as well. She started getting bad grades at school because she just wasn't really applying herself, and around the age of 14, when most of Elisabeth's friends were talking about their crushes and cute boys and who had dibs on who, Elisabeth had no interest in having these conversations either. She was seemingly uninterested in boys, or at least didn't like to talk about it, and when her friends would notice that she seemed down or off or strange, then they'd ask her like, what's wrong? She'd say, I can't say, or you know, if I say anything, I'm going to get in trouble, mostly from her father. So she just seemed to be sort of a withdrawn and distant person in her teenage years. Once Elisabeth went missing, police started to investigate her family to kind of find out if there was anything going on, any dysfunction, like why she would want to disappear. And they found that the Fritzl family seemed to be normal like any other family. Elisabeth's parents, Rosemary and Josef, were married in 1955, so they had a long-term marriage, and it was seen by most as being pretty good. The couple had 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters, and they lived in a rural village in Austria called Amstetten. Sure. Of the 7 children that the two had together, Elisabeth was the 4th, and the family was pretty well off. Josef was an electromechanic, whatever that is, and he made a ton of extra money in real estate. Isn't that always the way? Josef was a well-liked and well-respected man in the community. He was the type of guy, the community that they lived in was smaller, so he wasn't a stranger to anyone. Everyone knew who he was. Whenever he would go out into town and he'd walk down the street, he'd always have somebody to say hello to. And it wasn't like it was just the neighbors that he was close with. He was also close with people who were like prominent members of society, like police officers, bankers, government officials. He was like well-connected and well-to-do and well-respected. He was known for being, and I quote, good-natured, but with a strong character. But this was who Josef was to the community. Who he was at home to his family was a totally different story. The nice man, the well-respected man who just had a kind word for everyone he saw at home was an authoritarian, and he was very domineering, and his wife was unassuming and passive and just kind of let it happen, because in their household, Josef was in charge and she just let it be. That was the dynamic that they shared. He was very aggressive and violent to his family, particularly to Elisabeth. She definitely seemed to be the focus of most of his aggression, and he dominated her entirely. It was really weird. She was his focus. He would read her diary. He would go through her things. He would not let her have any friends. Like, no friends were allowed to come over. She wasn't allowed to have a boyfriend. She was kept totally isolated, and she was kept in the house. And to ensure this, that she was always alone, if he had to leave the house and he wouldn't be there to make sure she stayed in, he would take her with him when he would go to do jobs or do something away from the home. He had 6 other children, but he only did this with Elisabeth. Though police did think this was odd, learning all that information, they were like, that is a little bit weird. They didn't suspect Josef of any wrongdoing or as him being responsible for Elisabeth's disappearance. They instead saw him as maybe the reason that she up and left herself because she wanted to get away from her father, and the case was quickly closed. That was until 24 years later, when on April 19th, 2008, a young woman, a 19-year-old woman, was rushed to the hospital, and doctors noted that she was in bad shape. The girl was unconscious at the time she was brought into the hospital, and for whatever reason, doctors could not immediately determine what was wrong with her, what was causing her to be in just such horrible condition. This girl had cramps, epilepsy, lung failure, and kidney failure. So they were just like, what the fuck is going on? And they ended up actually even putting her into a medically induced coma to try to help her body heal while they figured out what the F was wrong with her. So they decide at this point to try to figure out who she is and look up her medical history. So they searched the name Kirsten, and that's because when she was rushed into the hospital, an older gentleman came with her. He's the one who brought her there, and he told the doctors that her name was Kirsten. So they look up her name, they go through so I don't know exactly how things work in Austria, but it appears from what I read that they have a nationwide medical history network on the computer. So you can search any person's name and bring up their whole medical history. So this is what they wanted to do, so they could find out if she had anything in her past that explained what is wrong with her so that they could better treat her. When they ran her name, nothing came up at all, which meant that technically this person should not even legally exist. Okay. In light of this, medical staff's like, okay, that's really weird. Let's go talk to this man who brought her in and get some more information. So they go to him and they're like, yo, why does this girl seem like she doesn't exist at all? We need to find out what's up with her. We need to see if maybe she has a genetic disorder in her history and her bloodline, because she's like fucked up. Like, we need to fix her. And he's like, nah, dog, she's good. Just patch her up, send her on her way. I want to get her home as soon as possible. And this man claimed to be her grandfather. But medical staff thought this was super weird, and they saw her grandfather's total lack of cooperation as concerning, especially paired with the fact that she didn't seem to exist. So the medical staff, the hospital, actually called the cops because it all seemed super duper sketch. When police showed up at the hospital to try to investigate this young girl, they talked to the girl's grandfather, who, spoiler alert, was 73-year-old Josef Fritzl, and they talked to him. This is when they find out that this girl's name is actually Kirsten Fritzl, and that she is the daughter of Elisabeth Fritzl, his daughter. Okay, so Kirsten is the daughter of Elisabeth Fritzl, who's been missing for 24 years. So police are like, okay, wait a minute. So you're telling me that this girl, who's 19 years old, is the daughter of your daughter, so your granddaughter, and your daughter's been missing for 24 years, but this girl's 19, so this girl was clearly born after your daughter ran away. And your daughter had no kids at the time she ran away, to confirm that. So what the fuck is going on? That makes no sense. And he's like, I know this is super weird, but here's what happened. I came home today, and I find this 19-year-old girl all fucked up on my porch with a note from Elisabeth that just simply said, like, listen, this is my daughter, your granddaughter. She's real messed up. I don't have the means to take care of her. Please help. That was his story. Police think that this is the weirdest thing they've ever heard in their lives, so they actually open an investigation into the case because they don't just buy Josef's story right off the bat. And medical officials also take to pleading to the media for Elisabeth to come to the hospital and help them, or for anyone who has seen Elisabeth to come to them and turn her in. Like, they're doing anything they can to find Elisabeth because Kirsten is in such... Kirsten? They're Austrian pronunciations, and I forget. I'm so sorry. But she was in such bad shape that they needed to speak to Elisabeth to see what was up and to test her for genetic abnormalities that she could have passed on to her daughter. Exactly 1 week after Kirsten was admitted into the hospital staff, everyone had their socks knocked off their feet when Elisabeth Fritzl, alongside her father, walked into the hospital. Just strolled on in like nothing had happened. Her first time showing her face to anyone. The first time anyone had seen her in over 2 decades. And here she was, just walking in the hospital like it was no big deal. And at first, Elisabeth didn't say anything. Her father spoke for her, said like, hey, I found her. This is her. You wanted her. Here she is. She wants to see her daughter. But immediately, the staff noted that Elisabeth just did not look right. Though Elisabeth now, after these 24 years, should have been 42 years old. That's how old biologically she would have been. She looked closer to 52 or 62. It looked as if her age had accelerated in the time that she was gone. Like a creepy ass movie. And she just looked unhealthy. Her skin was super pale and almost looked translucent. And she looked to be horribly sick, just like her daughter. And on top of that, when she just seemed terrified. She looked so scared. And when medical staff would try to talk to her and ask her where she had been, she was very hesitant to talk, to speak to them. And they could just tell that something was really up and wrong here. So they actually called police. Police arrive. And they decide that these two people, Elisabeth and Josef, they need to be questioned separately because Josef's doing all the talking, Elisabeth's terrified, and they're like, something's up. So they take them both to the police station. They separate them, and they start asking them questions while she's not there with him staring at her and speaking for her the whole time. After the two were separated, it took hours for Elisabeth to finally open up and tell her story, and it only happened after the police really hardcore interrogated her and even threatened her with jail time because they said that if she didn't tell them what was up, she could be charged with the illegal confinement of her daughter, since technically her daughter didn't exist and hadn't existed in all her 19 years, which is kind of a fucked up way to get the information they wanted. I don't know if they thought that she actually was involved or if they were just trying to scare her into speaking. But eventually, after 5 hours and a promise from police that she would never have to see her father again, she started to open up. This is when the horrible truth of what had really happened to Elisabeth came to light. She told police she had never run away. She had never joined a cult. She had instead been kidnapped and held in her father's cellar since 1984. And keep in mind, it's now 2008. And the reason her daughter is so sick and in such bad shape is because she too has been held captive in this underground cellar her entire life. Her entire 19 years of existence was her underground in the cellar. 19 years, your whole life. The media got a hold of the story, and of course it immediately spread like wildfire. Photos of Josef, and I believe it was just sketches of Elisabeth, because I don't believe there were any photos of her updated physical appearance anywhere that I could find. I'll have to look again, but I'm pretty sure it was sketches of her, and photos of Josef were plastered all over the front pages of magazines and newspapers, and simultaneously strangers and those people who knew and loved Elisabeth and knew and loved Josef were finding out at the same time what had happened and where she had been all of this time. And it was just crazy. It became a circus. This small town of Austria that was just like this small, quaint little area was flooded by reporters from all over the world trying to get the scoop and trying to get front page stories for their papers, magazines, publications, all that jazz. It was a madhouse. Because it's a crazy story. What would you do? I can't even imagine. I literally can't even imagine. So police arrest Josef, obviously, and immediately they start looking into him as a person, his background, his childhood. They want to find out everything they can about this man, this monster, this wolf in sheep's clothing. Josef Fritzl was born April 9th, 1935, making him an Aries. He was raised by his mother only after she and his father separated when he, Josef, was about 4. His father just straight abandoned the family, leaving Josef alone with his mother, and she was not described as being a very loving mother. She was said to not really like him, to not have wanted him. She wasn't a woman who wanted children, and reminded Josef of that constantly when he was growing up. And in addition to the mental abuse of something like that, something like learning your mother hates you and doesn't want you, she was also physically abusive to Josef from a young age and neglectful, leaving him alone at home for hours at a time to fend for himself. It's thought that because of his lack of love and empathy in his childhood, he grew up unable to give love and empathy to others later in life. It was also said of Josef's mother that she was the type of woman who only even had him as a child to prove that she was fertile enough to have a child, which is just disgusting and wild, and actually makes me really wonder about how that plays into how many children Josef ended up having with both his wife and then his daughter later in life. Speaking of later in life, it was said that Josef admitted that after buying a home as an adult, he let his mother move in with them and had at some point locked his mother in an attic, bricked over the windows, and kept her locked there until she died. But I have no idea if this was confirmed or just something he claimed to have happened. Once he was married, Josef mirrored his mother's behavior in life, being an aggressive and domineering head of his household. He would beat the shit out of his wife and kids on a whim for seemingly no reason. It seemed like he looked for reasons to hit them, really. And when he came home at the end of the day, the home had a quiet and eerie feeling to it because the kids were afraid to speak, afraid to step out of line because they didn't want to get beat up. And like his wife was being abused too, so she didn't do much to intervene, which is really sad for her and for the kids and for everyone involved, really. In addition to this, Josef was a freaking creep, as I'm sure you can imagine, because somebody with a normal brain doesn't just immediately lock their daughter captive and use her as a sex slave for 2 decades. But it started with him being a peeping Tom, walking down the street to watch strangers in intimate settings through their open windows. He then started to follow women. He'd follow them through parks and masturbate where they couldn't see him. When Josef was 32, he escalates a lot when he follows a woman home and rapes her in her apartment. He didn't get away with this, though. Luckily, he was caught, and he was given 18 months in prison. And after 15 years, per Australian law, his record was expunged, dude. And I have no idea why his wife stayed with him at this point. He was clearly a monster. But she did, and she even covered for him while he was in jail, telling her family and his family and anyone who asked where he was that he was away on a construction job. But really, he was in jail for following this woman into her home and raping her. And then his record would get expunged, so no one would know he did this. Once Josef was released from prison, he realized that his compulsions weren't going anywhere. He wasn't going to stop. This was who he was, and he needed to just embrace who he was and become the best version of a creepy rapist monster that he could be. He needed to figure out a good plan of how he could do this where he could get away with it, where he wouldn't get caught, because he couldn't stop. He didn't want to stop. So Josef started planning. He started planning what he was going to do years before he actually kidnapped Elisabeth. Like 6 years beforehand, dude. She was kidnapped in 1984, but he started plans to do this in like 1978. This was very creepily thought out, dude. Like, meticulous and just like, ugh. So it was in 1978 that Josef Fritzl got a permit to build an atomic bomb shelter under his home. And at first to me, I was like, that's really fucking weird. I would question that immediately. But this was in Austria. This was in the end of the Cold War. So it wasn't unusual for people to be doing this, to be building atomic bomb shelters in case the war went from being cold to being like hot, hot, hot. Apparently, when all was said and done, Josef Fritzl had straight up built an entire house under his own house. And he was able to do this so quietly without anyone realizing what he was doing because Josef was an engineer. He could do almost all of the work himself. He didn't have to worry about some pesky construction worker finding this, seeing this, building this, and being like, what the fuck is this? Because he was the pesky construction worker, and he wasn't asking any questions. So what Josef did is added a lock to his own basement door of his home so that no member of his family could go down there, and he would be like, yo, don't go down there, that's my space. And they'd be like, okay, I don't want to get beat up, I'm not going to do it. And he then built a whole ass dungeon under his home, complete with many rooms. Bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom. He installed electricity and lights and a refrigerator and hot plates, all complete with a security system so that he would be aware if anything went awry. And it was inescapable, dude. He had reinforced the door with concrete that grenades should not have been able to penetrate, and installed a padlock with like a code system for entry and exit, and only he knew the code. Wednesday, August 28th, 1984, Josef decided to put his plan into action. This was a perfect day for Josef because it was a day where his wife was going to be out of the home. So he asked his daughter Elisabeth to help him in the cellar, to help put a door in its frame. This was the last puzzle of the piece that Josef needed to complete his dungeon. And Elisabeth had no idea she was helping seal her own fate. So when she went and turned to leave, she had a soaked rag placed over her nose and mouth, and her world went dark. And when Elisabeth woke up, I cannot even imagine how horrified she was, because she woke up and she was handcuffed to a metal pole. And I can't even imagine what was going through her head. She was totally alone, and she had to be horrified for a couple of reasons. One, because you wake up alone in an underground dungeon and you're handcuffed to a pole. And two, you know who put you there. You know it's your father. And you know what he's capable of, because according to Elisabeth later, the sexual abuse started for her when she was around 11 or 12 years old. So when she wakes up in that dungeon, she knows what her father's capable of, what he's done to her in the past, and what her future in this dungeon likely looks like. Josef said of this decision, and I quote, "I was born to rape, and I held myself back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved a lot worse than locking up my daughter." The following day, Josef and his wife went and reported their daughter missing, and apparently Josef really played this up well, telling police that he was so worried about his daughter that he believed that she wouldn't have left voluntarily and that she must have been abducted. Like, he really played up the worried father, all while he had her down in his cellar and knew damn well where she was. It's just so disgusting. So Elisabeth is kept downstairs in a dungeon below her own home for 24 years. And what happened to her during her time in captivity is the stuff of nightmares and unimaginable. For the first 5 years of Elisabeth's captivity, she wouldn't see another human being at all day long until nightfall. And that's when her father would come to the dungeon. He wouldn't say a word to her. He'd put a leash on her like a dog, and he would rape her before leaving again, just to come back the next night and do the same thing all over again. But before he would leave her, he would tell her that if she tried to escape, he had gas rigged up in the dungeon, and he would gas her to death in this dungeon and no one would have any idea what ever happened to her, and then he'd fiddle with a gadget by the door to make it seem like he was setting up the gas. But it was later determined, once all of this came out and they checked it, that there was actually no gas. This was just a scare tactic to keep her compliant. It was after 5 years in captivity, when Elisabeth was 25 years old, that she became pregnant for the first time, and Josef, in response, bought her a medical book and a book on childbirth and was like, well, brush up on your knowledge of giving birth to children because you're doing this by yourself and I am not taking you to the hospital. He also brought her some towels and some medical supplies, just things he thought she may need for her at-home birth that she was going to have to do, which is just like outrageous to me. That part, maybe it's me personally being pregnant and thinking about that makes me cringe, but it makes me cringe. Somehow though, on August 30th, 1988, she was able to do it. And she lived to tell the tale. She gave birth alone in this dungeon to her firstborn child, her firstborn daughter, who she named Kirsten. And this was the daughter who would inevitably blow this entire case open all those years later. Over the years, Elisabeth had more children. She had a boy named Stefan on February 1st, 1990, a girl named Lisa on August 29th, 1992, and then another girl named Monica on February 26th, 1994. And you'd think that this would be bad for Josef, right? Like, this isn't the outcome that he'd want from having a sex slave in his dungeon, but later he told a psychiatrist the complete opposite. He said the whole point of taking and keeping his daughter Elisabeth was so that he could completely and 100% dominate and control her. And the more children he had with her, the more control he had over her. The more children he had with his own daughter, the more control he had over her. And that if she ever did get a chance to leave him, she would still be his, because who would want her at that point? He also made a point to further humiliate and dominate Elisabeth by raping her in front of her own children. But despite all of this, Elisabeth did the best she could with the cards that she was dealt. She loved her children, and she showed them endless affection to counteract the hate and abuse that they were receiving at the hands of their father/grandfather. Elisabeth protected them and she educated them. She taught them how to read and write, and everything she couldn't teach them, they would learn, well, everything they learned that she wasn't able to teach them, they learned from watching the TV they had down in the dungeon. This TV was their only view into the outside world. I mean, occasionally their father/grandfather would bring them things. He once brought them a bird to see in person, and he once brought them snow when it snowed outside. Most of their worldly experiences were seen just from what they saw on TV. The abuse continued with Elisabeth, as I'm sure you can imagine. It never stopped. And her father would even threaten to stop feeding her and to stop feeding the children if she would not give in to his sexual demands, which is just so gross. Ugh, so gross. But because of this, it did continue. And in 1996, Elisabeth became pregnant again, this time with twins, but only one of the twins would end up surviving. The two twins were born on April 28th, 1996, but one of the boys, his name was Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and he ended up not surviving because he was in a cold, dark cellar dungeon instead of being taken to the hospital. So literally, Elisabeth had to just sit there and watch one of her babies die because Josef refused to take him to the hospital. And after he died, Josef then discarded the evidence by burning his body. The other baby did survive, and this baby's name was Alexander. So it's at about this point that Josef realizes that, like, his cellar is a little small for his ever-growing family. So this genius decides to do something very strange to solve his problems. This is when Josef takes baby Liza. She is the loudest of all the children at her 9 months of age, and he takes her out of the cellar and he puts her in either a box or a basket. I saw it reported as both. Hardly matters. He puts her in it, and he takes this box or basket and he puts it in front of his own front door so his wife will find the baby. With this baby is a note from Elisabeth that said that this was her daughter, that she was alive, she was cool, everything was cool, don't look for her. But this was her kid. She could no longer take care of this baby, so please, noble parents of mine, help me by raising my child. So, to solve his problem, Josef takes the daughter of his daughter, the incestual offspring of Josef and his daughter Elisabeth, and brings it up, this baby who had been in a cellar all these months, from his daughter who had been in a cellar all these years. He brings this baby up and puts it on his doorstep so that his wife will raise this baby. And all the while, his wife has no idea. This is the way he wants to solve his problem of overcrowding. What? And slowly, this is how Josef introduces several of his and Elisabeth's children to his wife so that she and he can raise them above ground. First, it was baby Monica, I believe, who he put in a stroller and then left on the front porch. That same day, Rosemary, Elisabeth's mother, received a phone call from somebody she believed to be Elisabeth, who just was like, hey, yeah, it's me. I dropped her there. Please raise her. That would be tight. Thank you so much. Following Monica was Stefan, and then baby Alexander, who was the twin who survived. Josef took out these 3 children when they were still babies, so they could not tell of their experience and how they actually came to be there. And he strategically chose the loudest children to be the ones who were taken above ground so that the neighbors would not hear his children in his cellar dungeon and report it to the police. It's just absolutely wild. And it's not like, you know what's, okay, you know what's the most wild part of all of this? It's not like they kept this a secret, this adoption of these random kids. They went through the system. They went through the state, or whatever system there is for adopting babies. They did this. Social services was called. It was a whole thing. And they were legally allowed to adopt these children, even though Josef Fritzl had had a record for actually raping a woman at knife point. At this point, that had been expunged. So it didn't matter and it didn't affect the adoption process of him and his ancestral children. Anyway, because of the adoption, because of these adoptions, plural, social services was often at the house doing routine checkups, checking the house, checking the kids, making sure everything was alrighty. And there was nothing weird that was reported, nothing that raised any red flags, that was just seen as a normal family. And I think this just goes to show that there's a problem with the system everywhere. This isn't just an American problem. This is a problem everywhere where these social services, children's services are overstaffed, or no, understaffed and overworked, and things like this just fall through the cracks, and it's absolutely insane to me. And anyways, let's go back to Josef. So Josef was a total dick to his kids that were still in the cellar about the kids who were taken above ground. So the kids that were still down below were the 2 eldest and a baby that was born after the twins on December 16th, 2002. December 16th, 2002. And this was a baby named Felix. So he was kept down there as well. And side note, the only reason that Felix wasn't taken upstairs to live with the children upstairs, since he was young and he did make a lot of noise, is because at this point, Rosemary was overwhelmed with the amount of children she was now raising and could not take on yet another child. So he was like, fine, this one can stay down here with its mother. So while the children above ground were living normal lives, having barbecues and swimming in the summer, Josef would take photos of the above ground free children, and he would take them down and show them to the kids that were still in captivity, just to rub it in their faces, the type of life that the free kids were getting to have. And this is presumably how it would have stayed forever if Kirsten had not gotten so sick in April of 2008, and somehow Elisabeth was able to convince Josef to take Kirsten to the hospital. I'm not sure how she was able to do it. I'm not sure if Josef was thinking that a 19-year-old body of a woman might be harder to dispose of than baby Michael's was, or if somehow during the 19 years of her life, Josef had grown to love Kirsten in some fucking weird way. But somehow she did. Somehow she was able to convince him, and he did take her to the hospital, and then somehow she was able to convince him to take her, Elisabeth, to the hospital as well to see her daughter. The same daughter, the daughter who was 19 and in the hospital, the daughter who was a year older than she was when she was put into captivity. And it's just so crazy. The story is wild, bro. It's insane. Once the whole story broke and Elisabeth told the police what happened, they quickly rushed to the property and released the kids that were still being held captive. The youngest, Felix, was only 5 years old, dude. And the whole drive, him and his brother were being driven to the hospital to reunite with their mother. And little Felix had his face like glued to the window just staring out. He had never seen like open space or trees or the road or cars. And it must have been such a shock to his little baby system. It's just like, ugh. So police were so blown away to learn that he had a straight whole nother family, a family of 7 people living in the cellar of his home. And above them, just above their heads, another, I believe, 7 people. No. Yeah. Another like 7 people were living above and had no idea. They had no idea what the fuck was going on. No one had any idea. Isn't that fucking crazy? Bro. 7 must have just been this guy's lucky number or something. Fucking ew. And police just found out that he had done this. He had just arranged this so perfectly for himself. You know, he was such an aggressive, abusive, domineering man in his family life, in his upstairs home, that everyone in that home was terrified of him. He would say, like, this is my space. This basement is my space. You do not go there. That's where I work. That's mine, and mine alone. And he beat the shit out of his wife. He's beat the shit out of his kids, and they were afraid to cross him. So for all of those years, they just never went to the basement. And another thing that's super wild, dude, is, okay, the house that was above the cellar. It was a pretty decent sized house. There's a lot of room. There's a lot of bedrooms because, you know, they bought a big size home. And Josef would literally, during the time that Elisabeth was living in the cellar with all those kids, he would rent out rooms in his home to tenants. And they would live there. Like, so many people came and went throughout that house over those 24 years, and no one had any idea what was going on just below the fucking floorboards. Floorboards. And the tenants had very few rules in that home, but one of the rules that was the most important was that you do not go in the basement and you do not go in the garden, that the cellar was built below. And if he was to catch you breaking either of these rules, he would immediately terminate your lease. To keep up this ruse and this double life, Josef had also quit his engineering job and took a less demanding and less time-consuming job in real estate that offered him lots of business trips that would account for him being away for long periods of time. And what he would do during these long periods of time is, besides going down and spending days upon days in the cellar with his daughter and kids, he would also drive all the way to the other side of town to pick up any items that his secret family may need without having to chance running into someone who knew him. He'd buy them food, diapers, whatever they may need, and in the dead of night, he would grab these grocery bags and he'd take them down to the cellar to his secret family, and no one knew anything was going on. I know that there was at least one renter who came forward and said that he would see him occasionally coming late at night and walking through the garden with bags of groceries, but they didn't think this was weird because, like, people go grocery shopping. People bring home bags of groceries. This wasn't an odd thing to see, and so Josef was able to get away with this until he wasn't. So now we're back to where Josef was arrested and his trial set for March 16th of 2009, and everyone is just lined up waiting anxiously to hear what this man, this monster who could do something like this, had to say for himself. There were reporters from all over the country just waiting there, hoping to get a front row seat to this trial, but only 100 seats were actually awarded to the press to watch, report, take photos, etc., etc. When Josef arrived at his trial, he was surrounded by a bunch of police officers, probably to help him, and he was hiding his big, stupid fucking face with this, like, blue binder, and maybe it was to make it so you couldn't get photos, maybe it was to hide his shame, which he should feel shame. Shame on you, you human piece of garbage. One of the reporters who was there at the trial said of looking into the eyes of this monster, this man, Josef Fritzl, for the first time, and I quote, "His eyes are piercing, intimidating, frankly, even chilling, and there was a reason he was looking over the room. He'd heard that Elisabeth may be present to hear her father and see how he was going to react. He wants to meet his daughter's eyes." I'm not actually clear as to whether or not Elisabeth was present at Josef's trial. Some sources say yes, some sources say no, but Elisabeth's true physical appearance has never been shown since she's been found. There was only sketches of her released to the media, and her testimony was videotaped in advance, and it was only shown to the jury and to Josef, the accused. This was 11 hours of testimony. It was a lot of testimony. She had a lot to say about what her father did to her. So, Josef Fritzl was charged with rape, incest, kidnapping, slavery, and murder, and faced the maximum sentence of life in prison. And for clarity, the murder was of baby Michael, who he let die and then burned the body of. Josef said his motive for what he did was simple. His daughter was living a life that he did not approve of, that he did not think was good for her, and he had to intervene. He had to do what he could to save her from herself. He thought the life she was living was unacceptable. He said that she was addicted to drugs. So there was no evidence that she was addicted to drugs, and that he had to stop her from running off with this bad, drug-filled crowd. And that's why he initially locked her up. Why he then raped her continuously for years and had 7 children with her? That part, I don't know, man. That just happened naturally. Of course, that's the natural progression of locking your child up to save them from a drug-riddled crowd. It was only after he heard Elisabeth's testimony, heard the words from her mouth, heard her experience, her perspective, all from her point of view, that the gravity of what he did seemed to hit him, and he accepted what he had done, and he actually apologized for all the pain he had put his family through and took full responsibility for all of his crimes. He said of his daughter's capture and imprisonment for all those years, and I quote, "With every passing week in which I kept my daughter captive, my situation was getting crazier. I really was thinking about whether I should just let her go or not, but I was not able to make that decision. Although, or maybe exactly because of that, I knew that with every passing day, what I had done would be more severely judged. But I was afraid of being arrested and of having my family and everyone out there find out about my crime. And so I postponed my decision again and again until one day it really was too late to free Elisabeth and take her upstairs." After 4 days, Josef Fritzl was found guilty and he was given life in prison. Now, the big question, and something that comes up in this case a lot, and something that's on a lot of people's minds, is how much did Josef's wife, Rosemary, actually know about the situation? There are many that think that she was complicit or maybe even an accomplice, and I do have a lot of trouble believing that she didn't know anything at all, because it was 24 years that she was up in that house and Elisabeth was down below. And I do not believe that the dungeon was soundproof. That's why Josef didn't want people going over to the garden where his family was below, because he didn't want them to hear them. So it's hard for me to believe that in all of those years she never once went out to the garden, went down to the basement door when he wasn't home, and just listened or checked, didn't hear anything. That's hard for my brain to accept. She knew that her husband was always in the cellar, and after a while, like, he would just go at night, but after a while he would just go whenever he wanted, and he would stay down there for hours and sometimes overnight, and he would tell her that he was working there and that she wasn't to disturb him no matter what, not even to bring him coffee. And I just don't know, man. She was beaten. She was abused mentally and physically. So I just wonder, was she honestly just too afraid to cross him and never did go over there? Or did she go over there and she knew and she was just too afraid to ever say because of the abuse? Or maybe he had told her and she was too afraid to say something because of the abuse? Or maybe she suspected something but she was too afraid to raise her suspicions? I truly do not know. Her sister said in an interview that there's no way that Rosemary knew that she was the type of woman who lived for her kids, and if she had known or even suspected that it was happening, she would have put a stop to it. But I'm curious. What do you think? Either way, she was cleared by police and eventually accepted by her daughter, Elisabeth. So there's that. So Josef is in jail as of 2009 is when his trial took place. And I know nothing of Austrian law, okay? But he was given life imprisonment. But he is up for release in 2024. 2009 to 2024. That's life imprisonment. He will be 89 years old when he is up for being released. And that just seems ass bananas to me. In my opinion, at the very least, he should have gotten 1 year for every year of life he stole from his daughter and those children. 24 years for Elisabeth, 19 years for Kirsten, etc., etc., etc. Because these people are so damaged because of what he did to them. I cannot even imagine. And then to think that he will just get to go on at some point and just live any sort of life. I know he'll be 89 and that's old as fuck, but he should die behind bars, in my opinion. Oh, and just in case he ever does get released, apparently he changed his name while he was in prison, so now he's Josef Mayroff. So keep that in mind if you live in the area, because that's his new name apparently, that's all. After their release, Elisabeth and her kids stayed in a clinic for a year, just trying to heal mentally, emotionally, learn how to live life outside of those cellar walls and just be normal human beings. And to this day, they live in an undisclosed location and have stayed away from the media. And don't worry for anybody worrying about Kirsten. This does include her because she was able to recover from her illness and she was reunited with her family. They all changed their names, and it was reported that while living in the home that they're living in, they all have the doors removed and they're permanently removed. And I can't imagine the sense of freedom that that gives them, just to have the ability to know that they can leave whenever they want to. I did see at one point they were also going to weekly therapy sessions to try to cope with everything they went through. I don't know if they still are, but I know that they were at one point. And last, I also saw it reported that the home that they are all living in has armed security there at all times and CCTV footage that films everything to ensure their safety. So that's good. I can't imagine what their lives are like and what their brains are like. That's got to just be incredibly hard to get over, ever. And that, my friends, is the story of Josef Fritzl and his daughter, Elisabeth Fritzl, who he kept as a sex slave in his cellar for over 2 decades. Now, I know that this is an incredibly heavy one, but I still ask you, what do you think? Isn't that the most disgusting and unbelievable thing you've ever heard of in your life? I had no idea what I was in for when I started looking into this case. I had heard the name, but I had never looked into the story, and now I feel like I need to scrub my brain with a Brillo pad. I don't feel like I'll ever feel clean again now. And I have to imagine that that's how Elisabeth felt after everything she went through. Like, how do you go through that and ever come out whole again? I don't understand how she came out alive. She just went through so much, like all the rape and freaking isolation aside. She gave birth all those times alone in a dark cellar with no pain meds and no one there to help her, and she was just so helpless. And it's absolutely crazy to me, dude. I can't even imagine it. It makes my head and my body hurt. Like, because I know I'm gonna have a baby in a couple of months, right? And I cannot imagine I'm gonna have so much light and doctors and pain meds, and I'm still terrified. So to do it all by yourself, it makes my brain hurt. It makes everything hurt. No doctors, no bed, no comfy pillows, no medicine, no nothing. Just her alone forever. And it's just so sad to me, and it just sucks. People are the worst. This guy, Josef Fritzl, is fucking gross. And the fact that he could ever get out one day, no. No. Lock him up and throw away the key. People like that cannot be saved and do not deserve to be saved. I think he deserves the death penalty. I'm sorry, I just do. I go back and forth on that a lot, and I don't talk about my opinion on that, and I think it's a case-by-case basis, and this guy can fuck off. He can fuck right the fuck off. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you may want when looking into this case. I know this video is a long one. I've been filming for a very long time. And of course, I just thank you for remembering Elisabeth and her children with me today. I know this is the point where I usually give like a little recap about how I feel, but I feel like I have nothing to say. I feel like my brain has melted out of my skull. So please don't forget to let me know of any cases you would like to see me cover in the future. As you know, I have a long list of cases that I want to cover, but as this case indicates, every time you leave a suggestion, I put it down on the list with your name next to it to give you a shout out because you're tight, and I love your suggestions because you introduced me to some fucked up cases. And I want to hear all your ideas because I know you're filled with good taste and good ideas. Otherwise, you would not be here. Of course, don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell because I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically, you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media will be linked down below for your convenience. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook page, and Facebook group, along with a link to my merch shop where you can get this shirt and my Chillin' Not Killin' shirt. And I also list all the makeup I use down below if you want to know what this killer lid shade is or the nail polish. It'll all be linked down below for your pleasure. And speaking of this nail polish, it's themed, as I'm sure you can tell, because of the baby. And I did find out the gender. I found out the gender on my birthday, November 4th. So I'm going to be telling you guys soon. Should I do like a live stream? Comment down below if you want me to do a live stream maybe next week and let you guys know what this baby is going to be, because now I know. And now we can all... I get questions a lot about if I know yet, and I do. So let me know if you want to live stream, or maybe I can just announce it in like a normal video, but let me know down below. Of course, I want to say one more thank you to Dossier for wanting to work with me because it's so cool to work with you guys. I love it. I love it so much. You guys seem to like it a lot. I get very good positive responses, and it's just really, really cool to feel so validated by a company that you actually like. And of course, thank you guys for being tight as hell all the time. And with that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. At the very least, be a better person than Josef fucking Fritzl. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.